Well, here we go. All right. Well, welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be going into definitely a more bright, flowery, sunny type season in spring. So after the whole long, cold winter dormancy, everything opened up beautifully, and it wasn't cold again. Not. We'll get into that. But first off, I thought this would be a fun picture to start with. We are on Red Mountain, and a lot of people have asked, why is it called Red Mountain? Is it about the soil? Is this something about because there's lots of red grapes grown on Red Mountain, which there are. It's a lot of Bordeaux varieties and Syrah and Cabernet. But this is actually the reason why it's called Red Mountain. This is a picture of cheat grass. So it's not an indigenous grass. It's actually an invasive species grass. It's been here for a long time though, and it turns bright red like this in the spring, and the whole hillside will turn this sort of rosy pinkish color. And then sometimes, based on how the sun is shining on it, it will turn very red, which is pretty neat. So we're getting into spring. The cheatgrass is red. Red Mountain is coming alive, and we're getting into the very crucial time of bud break. So again, we're back to our yearly vine growing calendar. At this point, we are into the bud burst, flowering. This is a very fun, crucial time for the vine between April and June. And it starts with bud burst. Bud break, bud burst, similar terms, both meaning the same thing. We talked last week about how during dormancy, everything's just sort of waiting, that carbohydrates, all this energy and water and nutrients have been stored in the roots and in the trunks and cordons, just waiting for it to be the right temperature in order to push up and start the growing season. So when that temperature finally gets to that 50-degree threshold, that 50-degree Fahrenheit threshold, all those water nutrients are pushed up through the vines into the apical bud. And apical bud is basically just the bud at the apex of the plant. So the top parts, the highest part of the plant, and that's where it starts bursting through. And it bursts through these protective hairs and scaly barriers around the bud that has been protecting it all through winter, through the cold in the winter season. The cool thing about buds, though, is that bud is actually, it's a grapevine buds, like other buds in the other vines and other plants as well. It's actually a 2-season process. So buds are actually formed the previous spring from last year. And during that time, they're already growing and will determine how many sets or how many clusters they'll have on the eventual vine that'll form the following year. So it's amazing to see how that happens. And these are just 2 pictures. These are the first buds I could find on our property. The first are table grapes. There's just a few vines of table grapes down near the house called Black Manuka, which bursted pretty early, March 21st. And then our Cabernet Franc was the first to burst, at least that I saw on April 3rd. But this is up close, sort of what's happening inside a bud. So this is sort of a cross section. I found a lot of pictures of actual bud cross sections that I was thinking about using, but this was just a nice way to see what's going on pretty clearly. So the bud is forming basically at the notch between a leaf and a tendril in those portions on a shoot that's coming out of the vine. And within that bud, you can see here, this cool looking design right here is actually showing all the parts of the eventual shoot that will happen next year. So the apical meristem, so that's the very tippy top of a shoot. So if you look over on the right side of your screen, this shoot and this top part, that's the apical meristem. That's the very farthest point away from the base of the vine. That's where a lot of that rapid shoot growth is going to be directed. But then below that, you have all of these primordia, which are both inflorescence or flower cluster primordia and then tendril primordia for structure, for climbing purposes. And they'll usually alternate, and they'll already start being formed within this bud the year before. And then you'll see you have usually a secondary or a tertiary bud next to it, just in case that bud gets infected somehow, or if anything happens during the growing season to cause trouble. So that's basically what's going to be start shooting out into this, into the very beginning of the growing season. So this is an actual picture of this is that Cabernet Franc vine as well, just a little bit later. And you can see close up, this is a new shoot. So this is a 2022 shoot coming out of that spur pruned, that the old cane that was pruned. And already at this juncture, you can see there's a bud forming for next year. And I just think it's really interesting to see that you're constantly thinking of how, not just how this vintage is growing, but you're actually growing 2 vintages at a time. You're growing a bud that won't be fully shooted and formed until the following year. But you have your flowering part here, you have your leaf parts of the apical meristem up top. But all this is still a very delicate part of the vine that needs fairly good conditions. Not too cold, obviously it needs to be above 50 degrees, not too hot, and you definitely don't want to see cold. Unfortunately, this is what happened in the middle of April of this year. So this happened, this was, I think, it was either the first or second snowfall in that week, which was just incredible. A lot of big flakes though. It wasn't necessarily too cold, which was a good thing because again, extreme cold is a little more damaging than just snow. So while it looks pretty extreme, in fact, about 8 hours later that same day, it looks like that. So not too much to worry about. It's when something like that happens, if there's a lot of really tender parts of the vine, it could be troublesome. This was April 14th. That last picture, so if we went back to this, I believe this was taken on May 6th. So we're already a few weeks past this day, but it did still cause a little bit of damage. So that manuka, those table grapes that we have growing down by the house, since those had already bud burst in March, in the end of March, there was already some growth and some leaves that got damaged. So this is a picture of some of those young tender leaves that did get a little cold damage from that, and it has those brown curly leaves. Luckily, it didn't damage the whole crop. We currently have more huge clusters of manuka table grapes than we know what to do with. This sort of affects certain, just the leaves that had already started, but there were multiple buds along all through those vines that had not yet burst open. So we were good in order to get some grapes after that. So then we enter, after we get that bud to burst, we enter a period that is known as rapid shoot growth. And this is basically during that initial period, as soon as there's enough leaves on the plant to start photosynthesis, it's no longer relying on all the nutrients that have been stored in the roots. It can now use the sun's energy and start the process of photosynthesizing and then just rapidly burst up. Even to the point where it can grow an inch or two every single day. This is kind of a time lapse. I did my best to try to take a picture in the same spots for a couple months. It's not perfect. You can see the mountain behind you kind of shifts a little bit, but you get the idea of what is happening even just in this 2-month period between April 28th and July 2nd. And this is in our old block. This is the 1985 planting of Cabernet just next to the winery. So then after that happens, you have all this growth coming up, which is great. We have vines. Now is when you can start thinking a lot about canopy, which again, we'll get more into canopy management actually next week during the summer season, because I think there's a lot more to see there. It's a lot more, there's a lot more things that can be affected in summer. But one of the first things you can do, and one of the passes that happens around this time, is suckering. So what the vine is doing is a lot of the growth is going into those primary shoots, the shoots from those 2 buds that we left on the spur, which is where we want all of our fruit to be condensed. But you're also going to get a lot of leaves and little shoots that maybe shoot off from the trunk or from a cordon underneath, and you'll have some little extra leaves. Or sometimes you'll have a lot of growth at the base of the trunk. It's trying to reach out and send more leaves because we have low nutrient soils in general. It's one of the things that makes grape growing on red mountains so great is this. The vine is struggling to survive, and so it will send extra growth. But we want to go in and remove some of that growth. So this is one of the passes. It's suckering. This is a video of one of our vineyard workers going through, and you can see she's basically removing. She's looking pretty closely at which shoots are attached to the actual pruned spurs, where we really wanted to focus all of our growth in our fruit clusters, and taking off any of those extra growth around. Now, the one thing is, the reason to do this is that we want all the photosynthesis energy, all the new carbohydrates and things being generated in the plant to focus into fruiting canes and into the fruiting part. But there's also an issue where you don't want to oversucker. And this is something I did a little digging, and there is sort of a nice balance. If you remove too much of the leaves at this point, again, remember back to our bud, the cross-section of the bud, and talking about how bud grows over 2 seasons. This part of the vine and bud growth for the buds that will burst next year, this is a really crucial time for them to start deciding how many fruit clusters they have, even within the bud. And so if you remove too many leaves during suckering, during this spring session, they won't have enough energy to form, to make sure that the bud is prepared for dormancy and therefore prepared for the following season. So again, it's this really interesting balance that we have to take. But again, vines are pretty resilient, so they will find a way. So then we've suckered, there's lots of growth. We're getting to the point now where we're starting to see these tiny little eventual fruit clusters, and they kind of look like fruit clusters already, but they're not. There are these tiny little flowers or pre-flowers. This whole time, the flowering or bloom season is such a critical time for vintners and for winemakers and everything. This is a lot that happens now actually defines the eventual architecture of that cluster, what the shape of it's going to be, how full the cluster will be with berries, how even they ripen based on what's happening during flowering. So this, a lot of times when you look at vintage reports, often they will mention what's the weather during flowering because it's such a crucial time for the eventual crop. Warm soils can promote earlier flowering. Obviously, this is dependent on variety, kind of like cold hardiness. Different varieties have different temperatures where certain things happen. Same thing if soils start warming up, certain varieties might flower before others. But also, if the soil stays cooler, it can delay flowering, which is kind of what happened this year. We were delayed because we had an unusually cool and wet spring out here in Eastern Washington. So we were a couple weeks delayed by the time we got flowering and fruit set. Flowering typically begins when the air temperature reaches 68 degrees. It can still flower above 59, 60 degrees Fahrenheit. It just won't have as much success. You might have a little uneven pollination, which can lead to other issues. But luckily, most domesticated vines are hermaphroditic. So unlike almond trees and other orchards or other plants, crops where you do need maybe a bee population or some way to pollinate, most Vitis vinifera varieties are self-pollinating. So they have both male and female structures in order to do that. So the anthers and stamens, the oval and pistil, etc. There are a few exceptions. I remember doing research on Balkan wine regions, and they have a grape called Blatina. And Blatina is actually a Vitis vinifera variety, but it doesn't self-pollinate. So they have to plant other varieties next to it, either alternating rows or just in a vineyard block next to the block of Blatina in order to have some cross-pollination. And then this whole period, the flowering period or bloom, usually takes about 14 to 21 days from where the flower starts blooming and fruit set. And then just sort of zooming in on what's happening. It's funny, when flowering first happened out here, this is my first year being in a vineyard during this time. And I guess maybe it's because you think of spring, you think of bloom, you think of flowers, you have this certain visual idea of, oh, it's going to be so pretty, it's going to smell great, and there's just going to be flowers everywhere. And then you look closely, and you look a little closer, and you're like, what is happening? There's nothing happening. And this is what's happening. So this is a very zoomed in picture. I'll have another picture in a minute where you'll see what I'm talking about of what's happening in the vine. So this is where the petals, so this cap is basically formed by these petals eventually detaching from the base of the flower, and then they lift off as a cap, exposing these male portions, the anthers and the pistil. And then once the cap falls, that'll sort of basically release pollen, and it'll dust down onto the female parts. And then that's, I think I got that right. I might have mislabeled something, but this is viticulture 102, not 301. So that's a whole nother class. But once the pollen is dispersed, then that's when this whole flowering process is happening. Again, weather is super important here. If we get really strong winds or if rain's happening during this really crucial time, it can cause uneven pollination. The word shatter is used a lot. In French, it's collure, and it's basically when a cluster fails to pollinate many of the flowers on it. And so you'll see, and I'll have a picture of it next time, it's more in talking about fruit set, where you'll just have these little stems that turn into dust because they didn't actually pollinate and produce fruit from each flower. And that also just happens. There's varieties that are more susceptible to it than others. Merlot is one of them that tends to have a little more shatter naturally than something like Cabernet Sauvignon. But that's kind of what we're looking at during the flowering time. And this is some other pictures I took. So May 30th on the left, you can see here, it almost looks like there's already tiny, tiny little berries on that, but that's not. Those are the flowers before they burst open, before they separate and then form a cap and then fall. Whereas here, June 13th, you can see it's already starting. They look like little alien heads or something. And then these long, bushy clusters is a little further along into flowering. All right, so going back into, I was talking about how this class will be half, the seasons of the vine year, or of the vineyard year. And then also talking a little bit more about our new projects, the new plants that we're putting into the ground. So back over in block 4, at this point, the soil has been prepared, and now they're doing all the initial measurements for where we're going to be planting new rows. So at this point, they put on plow attachments to the tractors, and they're measuring out exactly where they want rows to be, what angle. We had talked about how we wanted ours to be at 15 degrees off of north for a better sun exposure. So that's what this is, going up towards the hillside. And so you'll see on the right here is going to be that 15-degree north-south-ish vine row. And then down here, you'll see this horizontal lines here that'll be the spacing of each vine within that row. And so that spacing is 4 feet from vine to vine, and the row spacing is going to be 7 feet from row to row, which you can kind of see there. And this is replacing that much wider spaced vineyard that was there before, that Merlot that we ripped out, which was planted as a 6x10 spacing. So again, I didn't do the math, but you can fit a lot more vines in the same area just because we're condensing the amount of plants planted there. And then we get to the fun new block. So we are lucky enough to have some incredible new neighbors, Brian and Jenny, who have purchased the property across the street from us. This is actually a property that's in between our original vineyard, and then there's a lower block or a lower vineyard that's just beyond those trees and the house that is in this picture that's no longer there. But down the hill from here is our other block. So there's this whole area in between, and we were lucky enough that our neighbors agreed to lease us the land and let us plant some new vines here. So we have about 3 more acres of vines going in. And so this is also, they went through and did a little measuring. And this is kind of what they did, just a little video of how that works. I have a lot of videos on this class. I hope that's okay. I thought it was more fun to really see how it's all working. But yeah, so that's Jose, one of our best tractor guys on Dick Boucher's vineyard team, marking out the new vineyard. At this time too, we were installing all the irrigation infrastructure. So this is a main line. So this is back up at block 4. Way in the distance here, you can see that white truck's parked right next to this little hut. There's a well there. That's one of the wells on property, in addition to the larger well over by the house. And so getting water from that well and then burying these lines all the way across this long block. This is looking from closer to where the well is, back the other direction. And so this is basically laying it out after everything's measured, knowing that we'll be able to have lines of irrigation for each row. And why is it crucial? Especially on Red Mountain, we need irrigation. We only get about 8 inches of rain per year. This year was a little odd because we had more than 8 years, but obviously on a year-to-year average, it's pretty low rainfall. And so we need that. We're not really able to dry farm, which is the term for just letting vines grow as nature sees fit. We do need to apply water, but also we're able to apply water when needed. So part of irrigation, and the beauty of it, is that we can control both what times during the growing season to water, how much to water, at what rates or for how long. And that's both to encourage growth during the most crucial times, like when we're first planting vines, when they do need a lot of water for roots to set and grow so that they'll establish themselves, or we'll decrease the amount of water we're giving to the vines in order to reduce vigor. So if we think the vines are growing too easily, we can turn the water off for a while, and then the vine will start realizing it needs to struggle a little bit more, and that struggling is what makes our fruits even better. This was also a good chance to update some of our water infrastructure, put in place some smarter technology. We have some new meters that I can read with an app on my phone, which is great as far as tracking water usage on the property. So it was nice to be able to get some fresh new irrigation and pipes in the ground. And then this is also super exciting. This is when vines finally got into the ground. And I'm looking at what date this was again. This was April 29th. So a little bit earlier than some of these other pictures and obviously of the flowering that were happening in the vineyard. But this is the season when we got vines on the ground. So on the left, you'll see these are a bunch of cuttings just in a fruit bin. They have to stay wet because if they dry out, that's bad news. You want to keep them wet so that those roots are ready to go and they're starting to wake up as soon as we get them in the ground. And then you can see in this picture, this has already been planted. These little cuttings are just little sticks in the ground. It doesn't look like much, but these are 2 different clones of Cabernet that were planted. And this is sort of this is the process. This is how it was done. They had this huge tractor with a huge tank of water, and they'd go in pairs. And someone would use that little drilling device. It's basically blasting water and drilling down at the same time. So you get this hole soaked in water, and then the others will follow and get the cuttings that are grafted onto rootstock down into the hole, get it all wet, and then someone falls behind and makes sure that those are nice and compacted. So again, very exciting. Shelly was gracious enough to run up to Block 4 and get this video and some pictures on that day. So that is basically it. So it actually didn't take as much time as I thought, but that's okay. We have time for a bunch of questions. This is spring, so much is happening. Next time we're gonna get into fruit set and looking at berry structure and berry growth. We'll also, like I said, talk more about canopy management. We'll get to the point where grapes are starting to turn different colors and go through their final ripening process. And then we'll check in back with our new blocks of vines, figure out what's the next step. We have to protect the baby vines. How do we do that? When is infrastructure like trellising and end posts going in? So we'll talk about all that next time. I know some of you joined in a little bit into that, into the presentation. That's totally fine. Maybe you still had a question pop up or something, but at this point, if you did have any comments or questions about anything you just saw, feel free to unmute and you can ask away. You can wave at me. You can use the chat box, however you'd like to ask any questions.
So I have a question. So I'm assuming we'll get to see on the field trip, we'll have a chance to look at Block 4, Nanax block, and kind of take a look at that. And I had a question. I know I've noticed a lot of times when there's new plantings, there are these white tubes that go around the, I guess the newly planted shoots, and that is specifically to protect them, or does that serve a larger function?
Yeah, basically, and we'll get into that next week as well. But so those are grow tubes that you want to put down, and basically it's to protect them from, we don't have a lot of like deer or animals here, but if any animals try to wander through and eat leaves, like we don't want anything to damage them as they're really young. It's also a way to protect the vine if you want to go through and do weed control too. So and we all have pictures too where. There's a fly, by the way. When you have the cuttings in the ground, you want to protect them so that you can go through and spray or control weeds, because at the very beginning, we don't want a lot of competition in the vine rows. Whereas with established vines, cover crops, grasses, other things in between rows is actually great because it both can give extra nutrients to the vine when it needs it, but it also is there for competition to reduce vigor in the vines. Whereas when they're super young baby vines on the ground, we want as little competition as possible. So that's another thing, is they'll put them on there to protect from sprays or from any other hitting them, even with like a tractor attachment.
So that stuff that grows between the vines, does that contribute at all to the flavor of the wine? I mean, I know the soil is critical, but do some of those growths and cover crops and things like that, is there ever any consideration as to, I mean, I would guess their contribution would be minimal.
So it's
But
really that's a really great question, and it's something I'm really interested in as well. Shelley and I actually recently did a tour with over at Weather Eye Vineyard, so the vineyard at
hmm
the top of Red Mountain, and got to talk to Ryan Johnson, the guy who planted that, about a similar thing. Because in you can think of it on the one hand of as weeds or other thing, and will it affect the grapes?
hmm
But in southern France and in other parts of the world, and here, a lot of people talk about garrigue or the scrubland, the herbs and rosemary and lavender and all these natural herbs in
hmm
southern France that grow near vineyards, and how sometimes you can smell that in the wine or taste that in the wine. And people have thought, oh, is there a reason? Like, is it just because they're next to it and they can touch the grapes and it pass their flavor on, or is there some reason why, or are we just tricking ourselves and is it actually a yeast aroma or some other flavor
Mm,
from the grapes? But Ryan is convinced that there is something to planting different plants next to grapevines. He has a lot of our sagebrush, so we have a lot of sagebrush on the
right.
property in Red Mountain around here. That's super fragrant, very like
hmm
minty sage sort of aroma. There's also lots of lavender planted all around. A lot of vineyards on Red
hmm
Mountain will have rows of lavender nearby, and there is this belief that those aromatics can actually get into the grapevines. And Ryan, and this is I need to look more into it because I was fascinated when he said it, but in Châteauneuf-du-Pape, so in southern France,
hmm
there's they are legally allowed to do flash pasteurization for their wines. They've written it into the bylaws. It's not really done. I mean, I think it's done. Other places might not be necessarily legal, but it's common with a few producers in Chateauneuf, and it's basically just when they get their must originally, they'll increase the temperature real quick to basically pasteurize the wine and protect it,
Right.
bring it back down. But there apparently is some byproduct of the flash pasteurization product that they can take, and they've measured and they've identified certain flavor or aromatic compounds
hmm
from lavender plants and from other rosemary or other plants that were nearby the vineyard, and not solely from grapevines. And so
That's really
who
cool.
knows? And it could be one thing that's pointing to that. I'm sure there's plenty of evidence that says no, that's
But
baloney.
I would think all of that makes up terroir. I mean, how does it, because
Absolutely.
it's not, all of this doesn't grow in a vacuum. I would think it would all somehow, I mean, as minuscule as it is, it probably adds to that terroir, whatever that is,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's a
kind
huge
of
part of
fun.
terror, and that's why a lot of producers are planting, lavender or letting things like sagebrush. If it's in the middle of the vineyard, they won't get rid of it because
Right.
they want to keep it there. So, and who knows when the weeds that are growing in Block 4 or in Annex, if by the time the vines are more established over the next couple of years, if they seem like they're beneficial in that way, then we might leave them there. We'll have to ask Dick Boucher on the field trip day because I think that's a really
That'd
interesting.
be fun.
Yeah.
So what's the projected first vineyard, not vineyard, vintage of the new blocks?
So because they went in this year, this is considered first leaf year. So when cuttings, basically they'll just call it first leaf, second leaf, third leaf, and that's how sometimes you'll hear people refer to
hmm
younger vines. So in first leaf year, again, their cuttings go in, they get their leaves, and then they grow just straight up that grow tube, and that's about it. And then over winter, when they go through to prune, that's when they start training two of the canes into eventual cordons, at least
hmm
with the training system we're doing. And so that next year you'll have more growth from there, and then they'll be able to prune back, and that's the second leaf. So 2023 will be our second leaf.
Okay.
Then over that next winter, they'll prune back again. And by that third leaf, so 2024 will be the first year that we can pick grapes and make wine. It'll produce fruit next year as well, but it's
It's
not very
probably,
often that people will make wine from it because it's just not going to be very complex, not very concentrated fruit. Because again, the vine is focusing a lot more of its energy, its carbohydrates, and its
just,
growth into photosynthesis and into
right.
establishing a plant as opposed to reproductive energy.
So we're talking maybe a 2026 release then.
Yeah, yeah, it's one of the saddest things when I get to tell people about our new vines going in the ground, and then have to say, yeah, 26, 27, these wines will be released to the public. But
Yeah.
that's kind of the nature, and that's also a reason a lot of people talk about if you wanted to start a winery, if you wanted to just cold plant a vineyard, start a winery, you're looking at least 5 years of nothing to sell. And so,
Right, right.
it's one of those epic gambles.
Patience is a virtue there.
Yeah, absolutely. Or it's the joke slash absolutely true fact that to make a large fortune in the wine business, you have to start with a small fortune. That's this.
Yeah,
It's almost
that
you
makes sense.
need a little bit of money and some capital and some patience if you wanted to start from scratch. Luckily, again, we were able to take over the Taptil, this vineyard here that had been here for a long time. So we actually still have some super well established vines to make wine from, sell fruit to. So from the business standpoint, we're able to take the risk of planting a lot of new vines because of that, which is nice.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
Is there anyone else that had a question about anything from spring class?
I have another question if nobody does.
Please, yeah, by
I'm
all means.
sorry.
Oh, this is great.
So you mentioned the wells for the irrigation, and I know that, that's kind of how Red Mountain started. When Kiona came in, they were digging, and I think at like 400 feet or whatever it is, they finally hit water. I don't know if the wells that you guys have there are all the wells as deep, or I also understand there is some irrigation now, like from the Yakima that was brought in. Is that true?
Yeah.
And do you see Avennia doing that at some point, or does that become cost prohibitive for distance?
Right. So all good questions. So yes, our wells on property, the two wells we have actually go down to 629 feet, I believe.
That's pretty deep, right?
Pretty deep. Our neighbors, the High Tower Sellers, were just drilling a water well this year, and I think they hit water at 621. So it takes a while to get to those aquifers down below us here. But there, like you said, there is it's called the Kennewick Irrigation District, KID, that is bringing water from the Yakima River just down the hill up into Red Mountain that we have access to, and we actually do use some of the KID water. And part of that is because for the amount of acreage that we are farming, that we're using, we only have a certain amount of water we can use through our water rights from the wells, from the actual property.
Okay.
And if we to add plants based on, and it's tricky because we have plenty of water, but there's also only certain areas we can use that plenty of water. And so some, like our lower block, for instance, down next to Hamilton, on the other side of the annex block that I was pointing out in that picture earlier, a lot of that is irrigated through KID, that we have certain lines irrigation. Now, some of the risks there are, you have to rely on the KID for maintenance. So I know I've talked to some other growers who have had issues just because oftentimes there'll be silt or sediment that comes up through the vines because a filter breaks, or if something needs to be replaced and it hasn't been, and you could have issues that way. And so you could get muddy water or just water that is not, super.
Yeah, I know that well.
Yeah, exactly. So so that's always a risk. But again, you also have the risk with the well water here that, you'll have a failure. I mean, or something could happen, something could break. Always, we had an issue this winter where our pumps froze or our pipes froze, and the pump decided to keep going, so we had a bunch of water out, just flooding the driveway for a while. So it's still farmland. There's still things will happen, but yeah, but there's plenty of water now, which is the great thing, because I know that was a struggle for a long time to get water rights on Red Mountain, but there is plenty of water now to use, so that we can still be planting grapes. So
who do you have to get the rights from?
It's the Department of Ecology. There's a lot of steps it takes to get, and I'm still learning this too. So I actually have two stacks of documents that I'm working through. That's all the history of these water rights, the water rights we have, and there's a whole process of getting them approved.
It's pretty complicated, right?
Yeah, it's a lot. I'm sure you deal with bureaucracy a whole lot too. It's of getting water rights, and then there's a difference between getting them, perfecting them, and there's a difference between a certificate and what usage rights. And so I'm still a novice at understanding how that all works, but
Understood, understood. So were you able to take over like tap teal? I mean, I would imagine tap teal had water rights, so are you able to assume those, or do you have to start all over?
Yep, no, we basically assumed those, and he assumed water rights from the owner before he bought the
Oh,
property as well, because the well is actually, there was someone who owned the property and drilled the original well was before our previous owner. So
okay.
as far as I know, again through my detective sleuth work. So
One last question,
yeah,
'cause nobody else is talking.
no, that's great. I'm sure
Um,
people, you're probably asking questions people are thinking about and might just be a little hesitant. So you're totally fine.
These are all great questions, Dina. Keep
Yeah,
asking.
yeah.
oh, thank you, thank you. I'm quite enthusiastic about this whole process, so as you can tell. So this might be a little off topic, but I was curious about, okay, so this year and the fact that it's so warm into late into the season, how I don't, so if I understand it correctly, it wouldn't affect the harvest this year, but how will it affect, will it have any impact on next year's, you know,
Next year,
grapes and next year and how they start up, or is this late warm weather setting up some particular conditions for next year's?
yeah, it's a good question. So when I was researching about bud development, which has that two-season um, growth cycle, it said that most of the stuff that's happening inside the bud that's going to become shoots and become fruit the following year happens kind of between flowering and veraison. So usually by veraison, which happens, I mean, usually
Like,
it happens in early August. This year it happened late August because we were kind of delayed. By that time, those buds have already decided how many flowering clusters they're going to have, how many tendrils, the and how many eventual even buds that shoot will produce, even within inside that one bud next year.
really?
So I don't know how much harvest, like the temperature, the weather we're having now, which has been beautiful, by the way. It's been like 77 and sunny every day, which is
It's been amazing, just,
perfect for
yeah.
harvest. I mean, it's also, we are catching up, and so a lot of harvest is happening all at once. I know our vineyard team has been super busy both yesterday and today, really long days of picking all over the mountain. So it's all happening at once. But I'm not sure how much that affects next year's crop inside the buds that are currently on the plants.
Because I know last class you talked about veraison and
Mhm.
how that's when the plant actually starts. As soon as that happens, the plant is already starting to kind of prepare, withdraw a little bit and start preparing for
For dormancy.
the dormancy period.
Yeah.
And it seems to me with the continued warm weather, that might get prolonged or delayed. So, but
Yeah,
apparently it doesn't really, it won't really affect the plant so much.
no, it's such a great question. My belief, and again, I could be wrong, and I can do a little research to see if, or we can wait and ask the expert in a couple of weeks.
I'll
But
bring all these questions with me and
okay, good, perfect.
on the tour.
I think that, so when we talk about the process of how the vine prepares for dormancy, at the same time that it's also preparing the fruit for harvest, I think that's what's happening. So when at veraison, the vine is basically now switching gears, and in one sense, it's focusing all its reproductive energy into grapes and into fruit ripening and sugar ripening and all that. And then at the same time, it's turning off the photosynthesis and the what's it called? I wrote down a couple of terms. I'm like, oh, I'll remember this, and this will help me. Vegetative versus reproductive. So,
Okay.
so when it turns on reproductive strategy during veraison, it's turning off vegetative, which is sending the signal for those buds to start hardening, for the hairs and scales to grow around them. So that's sort of the lead towards dormancy, even around that time.
Okay.
In the cane, whereas then the fruit cluster is now focusing on ripening, and they grow in size, and we'll talk more about this next week too. So
Okay, yeah, interesting. Yeah, two different kind of processes. The cane is doing one thing, but the fruit's doing something else.
yeah, that's from what I was reading. That's sort of how I made sense of it. Is that the plant kind of switches gears and it does both those things at the same time, both reproductive ripening and vegetative dormancy.
It's really pretty cool. Yeah. Okay.
It's fascinating. Yeah. It's such a cool plant. And we get to drink. How great is that? So.
Cheers. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks, Nina, for all those great questions. And yeah, if other questions pop up, or say you end up watching the video next week and a question pops up, just make sure to jot them down. So I guess that would be your only homework. It's volunteer homework. If something pops up and you want some answers, write it down, because then we'll get a lot more masterful instruction, I think, at back to school when we have Chris and Dick around to answer some of these questions, because they've been in the industry a lot longer than any of us. So
Eli, is it possible, and I don't know if this is if you can share these, the actual PowerPoint?
Oh yes, you could ask about that too. Yeah, I'm gonna figure out a way, because they're really large files, especially.
Okay, I get it.
All these videos in them, but I will figure out a way to get them to everyone who's. I
mean, I'd pay for a print copy or whatever. I mean, if it, because I think there's such good information on that, and I can't. I mean, I jot down notes, but it'd be kind of cool if if one could have that and kind of put the notes together and.
Oh, absolutely. No, we'll find a way. I mean, I could even probably print them, but I think, especially because there's video, it'd be nice to be able to get you a copy of the digital copy of the PowerPoint, so that way you can even see the videos within it. Well, I guess you could see that on the video recording also. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one can watch it on the YouTube thing, but even just all the information is kind of cool.
Yeah. I'll make sure we get. Maybe I'll have all of them printed out for when you come for the field trip day.
Oh, that'd be fun. Yeah.
Cool.
Thumbs up on that one.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much. Again, I've really enjoyed this. I've been learning so much, digging into all these things, and I wish I had more time in the day to learn even more. But that's life, I guess. But next week we'll join in again, and we'll do summer. Like I said, we'll talk about fruit development. It gets really exciting. Summer gets very exciting, because as soon as you start seeing grapes turn purple, it really just feels all alive, and it feels like it's a whole new game. So,
very cool.
So yeah. Well, thank you all, and again, keep an eye out for an email from me on Monday with the recording and the Zoom link for next week. But other than that, I hope you all have a wonderful evening, a wonderful weekend. Cheers to any wine you have this weekend. I hope you have some great wines to partake in, and yeah, we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much. This has been super awesome.
Very fun.
Thank you, guys. Yeah, we'll see you soon.
Bye.
Yep. Bye-bye.